In this video, we're going to talk about evolution. Let's first describe a theory. A theory is an idea that has gained enough evidence to have received widespread acceptance. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of evidence involved, there's widespread acceptance, but it is important to understand that that doesn't mean everyone agrees or accepts it as is, and that's okay. We are open to discord. And of course, nothing is permanent when it comes to a theory. Things can change over time. As we get new data, as we get more evidence, we can make modifications, and that's perfectly fine. So, what are some things that come to mind when you hear evolution? Well, a lot of people think of the word natural selection. So, evolution is described as a process that occurs because of the phenomenon of natural selection. Natural selection is when we see differences in survival rates due to different inherited traits. Let's talk a little further about the theory of evolution. So, we said that it occurs as a result of the phenomenon known as natural selection, and that natural selection is described as differences in survival rates due to different inherited characteristics. So, different survival rates. Some will survive and some will not, based on the traits that they received through reproduction. Another thing that we must describe regarding natural selection is the effect of natural selection on a species. We say that it favors the survival of certain members of the species. And also, it results in a change in the proportion of individuals with highly adaptive traits. So, what is a highly adaptive trait? Well, a highly adaptive trait is a trait that allows an organism to be successful, survive, and reproduce. And if those things happen, then offspring will result that also inherit those adaptive traits, and then we might see a change in the population over time. Let's talk about some vocabulary that's critical for you to be successful in this unit. The first word is a selecting agent. Now, a selecting agent is anything in the environment that plays a role in determining which species can live or which species dies. For example, food, space, water, and mates. If any of these are lacking, that would be a selecting agent that might determine an organism will die off. Then there's environmental conditions like the weather, the temperature. If the temperature is too warm, then organisms who require the weather to be cooler might not be successful. And then biological factors like predators and diseases. All of these things are selecting agents that will play a role in determining which species lives or which species may die. Genetic diversity. Genetic diversity refers to all of the genetic differences we see in a given population. The more diverse a population, the better the chance of survival. The more diverse. So if you think about an example where an entire population is all genetically the same, so clones, if there's one thing that can kill the clones, one disease, then that means that disease can wipe out every member of that population, and therefore that population has a chance of going extinct in a local area or even off the planet. So genetic diversity allows for a better chance of a population survival. Then we come to reproductive advantage. This is going to be another word for adaptive advantage. An adaptive advantage. So if a trait has a reproductive advantage, then it will increase in the population. We will see it increasing over time because we will see more and more individuals born with that reproductive advantage survive, reproduce, and pass that trait on to children. The next vocabulary word is extinction. It's probably one of the most commonly used words when it comes to natural selection or evolution. And in this case, a species might become extinct if they lack the variation necessary to adapt to a changing environment. If there's a variation that is required for survival in a particular environment and an organism lacks this variation, they might go extinct. Maybe they were not fit for their environment. Maybe they were fit at one point, but as a result of the changing environment, they no longer were. And then lastly, maybe they could not successfully compete. So you think about, well, what couldn't they compete for? Well, it's always going to be the things we require for survival. So they couldn't successfully compete for food or water or space or shelter or mates. And finally, the last word is common ancestry. So a common ancestry refers to organisms that might have one individual ancestor and then they branched off of that individual. An example would be coffee beans and cacao, which is the bean where we make chocolate. They actually both contain a chemical, which you're probably familiar with, called caffeine. The fact that coffee beans and cacao both contain caffeine means that they might share a common ancestor. And then another example would be zebra and donkeys and horses. When we examine their DNA, we find that their DNA is quite similar. And as a result of having similar DNA sequences, these organisms also might share a common ancestor. We talked a bit about natural selection and evolution, but what does it look like to say species may change over time? Organisms best adapted to a changed environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to offspring. So here's a little look at this simple animation that I created showing insects. Just watch it for a moment. What do you notice is happening? A lot of people like to say the red ones are turning into the green ones. But is that really what's happening here? When you see the animation cycling through, at the start, there were already red insects. There were already green insects. So there was genetic diversity at the start. Remember, diversity gives a population the best chance of survival. If there were only red ones to start, we might not have this insect any longer, but there were red and green. The green ones had an adaptive advantage. They had a reproductive advantage. They were best adapted or well suited to their environment. Could be as simple as they blended better with their surroundings. Now, the insect didn't do that on purpose. Make sure you understand there was no thought process here. The insect just happens to have diversity within the population, red and green. And over time, we see that the green ones had a better chance of survival. Let's take a look at another animation I created. The pink bacteria did not turn into brown bacteria. In the population, there was genetic diversity. The pink ones and the brown ones already existed. There was already variety. It's just that there was some reproductive advantage or adaptive advantage for the brown ones. Something about the brown bacteria allowed them to survive because they were better suited to their environment. They were best adapted to their environment, so they were more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes. That's what it means when we talk about natural selection. Let's talk about some triggers for evolution. What are things that must take place in order for evolution to occur? We're going to discuss 3 of them. The first one is reproduction, specifically sexual reproduction. In order for evolution to take place, organisms must be able to reproduce successfully. The process of sexual reproduction is also very important for the process of evolution. One reason is that meiosis and fertilization directly produce many of the variations that are going to be required in order for evolution to take place. Since sexual reproduction increases variety, it's going to also increase a species' chance for survival. The next thing is sex cells. There must be a change in the genes of sex cells. If we have a change in a body cell, that is not going to contribute to evolution. So changes in sex cells will contribute to evolution, but a change in a body cell will not. So what is that change we're discussing? We're talking about a mutation. Mutations must happen in a sex cell in order for evolution to occur. And finally, we must have variation. There must be a variety within a population. Let's talk about triggers that speed up evolution. We're going to discuss 3 triggers that speed up the process of evolution. The first one is a fast reproductive rate. The second one is a changing environment. And the last one is a mutation. The first one, fast reproductive rate. We see this very commonly in bacteria. The faster an organism reproduces, the more likely that they're going to have mutations when copying their DNA. When a mutation happens in bacteria, they're going to pass that mutation on to their offspring. When mutations happen in a sex cell of a sexually reproducing organism, that mutation will be passed on as well. If the mutation happens in a body cell, we will not see the mutation passed on. And then changing environment. Organisms that are in stable environments do not have evolution occurring at a fast rate. But in a changing environment, such that we see with climate change, the organisms best suited for the new environment will be the ones that survive. So, what are some examples that we can see? The first one is the birds of paradise. The birds of paradise, as you can see from these two animations from the movie Our Planet Birds of Paradise, show that behaviors in some organisms are going to help the organism survive. And because it helps them survive, it's going to be passed down to their offspring, and we're going to see it manifested as a common behavior in a population. You can see the bird on the left. He's performing a very interesting mating dance or mating ritual for the female in hopes that he will be able to mate with her and pass on his genes. And then the organism on the right, that beautiful red and yellow bird, is doing the same thing, only it has its own version of a mating dance or a courtship where it's trying to attract a female and then hopefully mate to pass on its genes. So the fact that these behaviors help the organism survive in the past, we now see them commonplace in their population. The second one is antibiotic resistance. You can see the animation that I showed you a moment ago that I created, and it's showing that in a particular population of bacteria, when exposed to an antibiotic, some of the bacteria already had a mutation that allowed them to survive. The ones without the mutation for survival died off when the antibiotic was applied. The ones with the mutation for survival survived even when the antibiotic was applied to those bacteria. Since they survived, they were the ones to pass on their genes, and now we have an entire population of antibiotic resistant bacteria. So that's how we actually wind up with these organisms, these pathogens that have resistance to certain antibiotics. So let's say we have E. coli, which is a bacteria, and let's say it now has resistance to penicillin. Well, how did that happen? What happened is a mutation took place at some point in time, which inferred resistance to penicillin. This was not purposeful, and it wasn't the penicillin that caused the mutation. It was just some change in the genome or sequence in the E. coli bacteria. So the mutation inferred resistance. And then when we applied penicillin to a population of bacteria, the bacteria that had the resistance survived, and the ones without the resistance, in this case, the pink ones, were susceptible to the penicillin and they died off. That left us with an entire population of bacteria that are resistant to penicillin. Let's talk about insecticide resistance. So here we have the animation I showed you before, the animation I created. So what's happening here? Well, someone went into their backyard and sprayed a pesticide, in this case, an insecticide, which is a chemical that kills insects. But at some point in time, a mutation happened, and that mutation inferred resistance to this insecticide. Remember, the insecticide did not cause the mutation. And so, as a result, when we spray the insecticide on this population, it's going to kill off all of the susceptible insects. So the susceptible ones die. The resistant ones survive. They survive because they have some advantageous trait that prevents them from dying when the insecticide is applied. In this case, the red ones are susceptible and the green ones are resistant. Over time, this leaves us with an entire population of insecticide-resistant insects. So, when is evolution not likely to occur in a population? There are a few examples that would decrease the rate of evolution. And the first thing is stability. When an ecosystem is very stable, in other words, there is no changes in the environment, that's going to decrease the rate of evolution. Another thing will be a long gestation period. So, organisms that have a slow reproduction rate, that's going to decrease the rate of evolution. And then finally, in sexually reproducing organisms, when mutations occur in body cells, we are going to decrease the rate of evolution. If you take a look at the animation, that's going to show a population just like the one with the insects we saw before. In this case, though, we kept the environment stable. We did not apply insecticide or pesticide. By not applying the pesticide, we did not select for or against any insect. By not applying the pesticide, we ensured that the red insects, which would have died off with the pesticide application, we ensured that the red ones survived equally as well as the green ones. So, in a stable environment, as you see in this animation, evolution is less likely to occur. What are other examples? Well, an example would be elephants. Elephants have a very long gestation period. So, in elephants, where we see them in a constant stable environment, such as elephants that are in a wildlife preserve, where humans can control for the environment and its stability, those are going to be kept under constant conditions, and therefore we would slow the rate of changes or evolution rate. Let's talk about branching tree diagrams. In this branching tree diagram, we have 7 organisms at the tips here and 1 organism at the base. This organism down here at the base is considered the common ancestor. What that means is this organism might have given rise to all of the other organisms. At the first point right here, we see that there were changes that might have produced sponges. Remember, sponges are animals. And then moving up the tree diagram, we see additional changes that might have produced corals. At this point here, we have the most recent common ancestor of snails, earthworms, insects, sea stars, and mammals. Moving up the diagram, we see that there is a common ancestor for snails, earthworms, and insects, and a common ancestor for sea stars and mammals. Taking all of this into consideration, it's showing us that all of these organisms share one common ancestor, but then if we wanted to get more specific, we could see that lots of groups share their own common ancestor. So from this diagram, we would say that sea stars and mammals are more closely related to each other than they are to sponges.